When Hunter Jackson, the arrogant son of the wealthiest family on the entire street, challenged Mason Carter to a fight in front of a crowd, everyone assumed the quiet single father would simply walk away. Hunter had no idea that Mason had once led classified missions as a Navy SEAL, operations that remained sealed to this day. But Mason had no interest in humiliating a reckless young man. He only wanted to protect his home, his dignity, and the daughter sleeping inside. Then Catherine stepped out of her car, watched the scene unfold, and quietly began to suspect the truth. If you truly believe real strength walks hand in hand with mercy, stay with us and discover this whole story. Mason Carter lived with his daughter Grace in a 2-story wooden house at the far end of Hawthorne Ridge, a neighborhood where old money and new fortunes competed for the best view of the valley. The house was not grand. It had a carefully tended garden, a small workshop behind the kitchen, and a wooden swing his late wife had chosen herself, years before illness took her away and left him raising their daughter alone. The house carried more meaning than any appraisal could capture. Before she died, his wife had made him promise one thing above all else, that Grace would never lose another place she called home. Beside that modest house rose the new estate belonging to Lucas Jackson, a compound many times larger than anything else on the street, wrapped in stone walls, framed by a private pool, a guest house, and a dense ring of security cameras that watched every angle of the property. Lucas wanted to run a private access road through the edge of Mason's land, a route that would raise the value of his new resort development by a fortune. Mason had already refused once. The proposed road would cut directly through the garden and through the exact spot where Grace's swing had stood for years. After that refusal, the construction crews found small ways to make life difficult. Delivery trucks blocked Mason's driveway for hours at a time. Workers left building materials stacked just past the property line. Security cameras from the estate were quietly repositioned to face directly into his backyard. Music and parties ran late into the night, and several young trees along the border were cut down without so much as a knock on his door. Mason never raised his voice about any of it. He photographed each incident, logged the date and time with careful precision, and filed a formal report with the local zoning office. His calm only seemed to irritate Lucas more than an argument ever could have. It was around this time that Hunter Jackson returned from an extended vacation, announcing to anyone who would listen that he intended to handle the stubborn neighbor himself, since his father was clearly too busy for such a small matter. Hunter watched Mason working alone in a faded shirt, repairing a section of fence by hand, and concluded from that single image that the man was poor, powerless, and utterly without connections worth worrying about. He began mocking Mason openly in front of his friends, tossing insults over the fence line as though testing how far he could push before something happened. Mason never answered in kind. He simply asked Hunter, evenly and without heat, to stay off his land. Hunter mistook that restraint for fear, the same way a man staring at still water sometimes forgets how deep it runs beneath the surface. One evening, Grace stepped out onto the porch and called her father in for dinner. Mason's entire posture softened the moment he heard her voice. He set down his tools without a word and walked inside, leaving the fence half repaired behind him. Hunter watched the exchange from across the property line and laughed under his breath, certain that a man so consumed with a child could never pose a real threat to a Jackson. What Hunter failed to understand was that he had judged Mason by everything visible on the surface, while the most dangerous part of the man was buried in exactly the places he had spent 12 careful years learning how to hide. The following morning, Mason discovered that an entire section of his fence had been crushed by an excavator belonging to the Jackson construction crew. The site manager shrugged it off as an accident and promised repairs at some unspecified later date. Mason knelt beside the tire tracks and studied the pattern carefully. The machine had turned deliberately, tight and sharp, right at the boundary marker separating the two properties. This was no accident, and Mason knew the difference between carelessness and intention better than most men alive. Hunter stood by the pool filming himself with a phone, announcing loudly to no one in particular that the neighborhood would look so much better once that old house finally disappeared. Mason calmly asked the crew to remove their equipment from his land. Hunter closed the distance between them, pressing his face uncomfortably close, clearly hoping to provoke a reaction the cameras could capture. Mason did not touch him. He did not even raise his hands. That same afternoon, Catherine Bennett arrived at the estate to discuss the acquisition of Jackson Global Security, a deal that had occupied months of due diligence and careful negotiation. She noticed Mason quietly rebuilding his fence alone, working with steady, unhurried hands. Lucas described him to her as a greedy neighbor clinging to a worthless strip of land purely to extract a higher payout. Catherine had no reason yet to doubt the story, so she simply filed the information away. Still, something about Mason's stillness did not match the picture Lucas painted. A man trying to extort money rarely carried himself with that particular kind of quiet control. His stance, his awareness of the space around him, and the way he reacted to sudden sound all caught her attention in a way she could not immediately explain. Masons always seemed to know exactly who stood behind him without ever needing to turn and check. Later that day came the first real collision. Hunter drove an off-road vehicle across the lawn, sending gravel and torn earth flying toward Mason. When Mason asked him to stop, Hunter deliberately steered even closer, testing how far he could push. Mason shifted his weight by the smallest possible margin, caught the steering wheel at precisely the right instant, and stalled the engine without so much as unsettling Hunter in his seat. The movement happened so quickly that Hunter's friends had no idea what they had just witnessed. Humiliated in front of his audience, Hunter jumped down from the vehicle and shoved Mason hard in the chest. Mason did not retreat, not even half a step. Catherine watched the entire exchange from the balcony above, and understood immediately that Mason could have thrown Hunter to the ground without effort. He had chosen, quite deliberately, not to. Mason spoke quietly, warning Hunter to stop before he caused something that could never be undone. Hunter responded by announcing that the Jackson family was hosting a charity sporting event that weekend, and he dared Mason to show up and step into the ring. In front of the rolling camera, Hunter issued the challenge directly, taunting Mason to prove his strength was real. Mason refused, seeing no reason to fight for anyone's entertainment. Hunter then glanced toward the house where Grace was sleeping and let a cruel remark slip about Mason's family. For one brief instant, something shifted behind Mason's eyes. Not the heat of ordinary anger, but a colder stillness, the kind carried only by men who have faced real danger and learned to master it completely. Catherine was the only person present who noticed that change at all. Lucas organized a charity fundraiser on the estate grounds under the banner of supporting wounded veterans, though most of the money quietly served a different purpose, promoting the pending deal between his company and Bennett Strategic Systems. Hunter built an outdoor exhibition ring for the occasion and invited a trainer, a camera crew, and several online personalities eager for footage. The true goal had nothing to do with charity. Hunter wanted a public stage to humiliate Mason and force him out of the neighborhood for good. Mason had no intention of attending. The invitation had arrived days earlier, tucked into his mailbox alongside a glossy brochure for the resort development, and he had thrown it away without a second glance. He had spent the afternoon instead helping Grace stretch a fresh canvas across a wooden frame, content to let the noise from next door remain someone else's problem. Then he received word that Hunter had sent workers to pull up the boundary stakes between the two properties in the middle of the event itself, using the crowd and the music as cover for exactly the kind of quiet violation Mason had been documenting for weeks. Mason crossed onto the estate to demand the trespassing stop immediately, moving through the party guests with the same unhurried calm he carried into every confrontation. Hunter seized the moment and turned the confrontation into a performance. He grabbed a microphone, introduced Mason to the crowd as the troublesome neighbor everyone had heard about, and repeated his earlier challenge for all to hear. The audience cheered, assuming the whole scene had been staged as entertainment. Mason declined a second time and asked instead to speak directly with Lucas about the property line. Hunter crossed a line of his own. He blocked Mason's path, shoved his shoulder, and knocked a small wooden box from his hands. Inside were little painted markers Grace had made to label the trees in their garden, and one splintered as it hit the ground. Mason knelt and gathered the pieces without reacting. Believing he had already won, Hunter kept pushing, calling Mason a failure who survived on pity after losing his wife. Catherine stepped forward to intervene, but Lucas quietly told her to stay out of it, insisting his son was simply teaching Mason a lesson in community manners. It was in that moment Catherine began to see that Lucas was nothing like the polished businessman he presented to the world. Mason finally agreed to step into the ring, though he set 3 conditions first. The match would last exactly 1 round. No weapons of any kind would be allowed, and once it ended, Hunter would halt every act of trespassing on the property until the authorities reached a formal ruling. Mason made clear that the outcome of a single match would never decide ownership of land. Legal questions would be settled through documents and the courts, nothing more, a distinction that kept the story grounded and prevented him from gambling his family's home on a meaningless brawl. Hunter accepted without hesitation, certain of an easy victory. As Mason removed his watch and set his phone aside before stepping onto the mat, Catherine noticed a small scar near his wrist, the kind she had seen before on specialists who had worked in classified operations for her own company. When the referee asked whether Mason had ever competed before, he answered simply that it had not been in the way the man was imagining. A ring light buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow across the mat, and somewhere behind the crowd a caterer kept refilling glasses as though nothing unusual were about to happen at all. The match began beneath a roar of cheering voices, few of whom understood what they were truly about to witness. Hunter opened with a flurry of heavy, showy punches, eager to end things quickly and hand the camera crew a dramatic clip. Mason simply slipped each one, shifting his weight just enough to let every strike pass harmlessly through empty air. Each time Hunter swung, Mason moved the exact distance necessary and no more, wasting nothing. The crowd laughed at first, assuming Mason was only running from a fight he could not win, some of them already calling out for the older man to give up and admit defeat. Catherine saw something entirely different unfolding in front of her, a discipline that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a lifetime of training most people in that crowd would never encounter. Mason was controlling the distance between them with total precision, all while tracking Hunter's hands, his feet, his breathing, and even the positions of the people gathered around the ring. Frustrated that nothing landed, Hunter faked a stumble and then threw a strike after the referee had called for a pause. Mason blocked it with one hand, barely breaking stride. Hunter followed with a knee aimed at a dangerous target, and Mason answered by turning his body, locking Hunter's arm, and forcing him to his knees in under 2 seconds. Mason could have dislocated the shoulder entirely. Instead, he released the hold at once. Hunter scrambled up and charged again. Mason dropped him to the mat with a single clean motion, cushioning the back of his head with an open palm so the fall would not injure him. The contrast between the two men had become impossible to miss. Hunter wanted to cause real harm. Mason kept protecting him even while holding him completely helpless. Then Hunter reached into his glove for a small metal object he had hidden there before the match began. Catherine caught the flash of light against metal and shouted a warning from the edge of the crowd. Mason reacted before her sentence finished. He twisted Hunter's wrist, stripped the object from his hand, pinned both arms behind his back, and pressed him down against the mat. The entire sequence happened faster than the cameras could properly capture. Mason threw no further strikes. He placed the object down in front of the referee and said, simply, that Hunter had lost the moment he decided to cheat. An older man near the front of the crowd, a veteran himself, recognized the technique Mason had just used to disarm and restrain his opponent. He called out an old nickname across the noise of the gathering. Mason turned toward the voice, and for a moment the entire atmosphere around him seemed to shift. Catherine remembered a partially declassified report she had once read about a Navy SEAL hostage rescue operation somewhere in the Middle East, led by a commander known only by that same nickname, his real identity carefully sealed from public record. The pieces began falling into place in her mind. Hunter lay on the mat, terrified and bracing for a blow that never came. Mason simply released him, stepped back, and bent down to retrieve the broken wooden marker from where it had fallen earlier. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for Hunter alone to hear, telling him that he had not lost because Mason was stronger, but because he had never once considered that actions carry consequences. Mason walked away from the event without celebration, without a single glance back at the cheering crowd behind him. Catherine watched him go, understanding that she had just witnessed the most dangerous man in that entire gathering choose, deliberately and completely, to be the most merciful one there. Lucas understood immediately that the match had damaged his family's image, so he ordered his media team to cut the footage into something more useful. The version they released online showed only Mason locking Hunter's arm and slamming him to the mat, with every earlier moment of Hunter cheating, taunting, and striking first quietly removed from the frame. The headline described Mason as a dangerous former serviceman who had attacked the son of a respected local businessman. Lucas went further, using his connections to file a formal complaint demanding an investigation into Mason for violent conduct. The consequences arrived quickly. One of Mason's consulting clients paused their contract without explanation, citing vague concerns about optics. A few neighbors began avoiding eye contact whenever he stepped outside, crossing to the far side of the street rather than pass too close to his gate. Reporters started gathering near the end of his driveway, waiting for a statement he had no intention of giving, their vans idling along the curb from early morning until well past dusk. Mason could not simply release his military file to defend his reputation, since much of his past remained tied to operations that were still classified. Instead, he handed the full footage from his own home cameras to his attorney and continued moving through his days as normally as he could manage. Grace asked once why strangers kept standing outside their gate. Mason offered no detailed explanation. He told her only that sometimes the truth needed time to travel the whole distance before people were ready to hear it. Afterward, he arranged for Grace to stay with a family friend for 2 days, keeping her away from the cameras and the noise gathering outside their home. From that point forward, she ripped apart from the escalating conflict entirely. Catherine pressed Lucas for the complete unedited recording from the event. Lucas insisted the main camera had malfunctioned that evening. Catherine knew immediately that this was a lie, since the very security system Jackson Global Security marketed to clients was built around multiple redundant backups specifically to prevent that kind of failure. She halted the acquisition process without further discussion. Lucas warned her that if the deal collapsed, her own board would assume she had let personal feelings toward a stranger cloud her judgment. Catherine answered plainly that she was not protecting Mason at all. She was protecting her company from a partner willing to hide evidence the moment it became inconvenient. Hunter, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated that Mason had not been arrested. He began driving past the house late at night, aiming his headlights directly at the windows and leaving threatening messages scrawled across the fence. Mason noticed each incident but refused to escalate the confrontation further. He installed additional cameras around the property and quietly moved several important documents out of his workshop and into a more secure location. An old instinct, sharpened across years of dangerous work, told him this had stopped being a simple dispute between two neighbors. Someone was searching for something specific inside his house, and Mason intended to find out exactly what it was before anyone else did. He walked the perimeter of the property each night after that, checking locks, testing sensors, and memorizing every shadow the way he once memorized the layout of unfamiliar rooms half a world away. Catherine asked her legal team to review whatever public records existed on Mason Carter. What came back was a file with a gap stretching nearly 12 years. Before that gap, Mason had been a promising competitive swimmer. Afterward, he reappeared listed as a maritime security specialist and the recipient of several commendations whose exact reasons were never specified. Catherine reached out to a former Department of Defense advisor she had known for years. The man would not confirm anything about Mason's identity, but he cautioned her strongly against judging anyone based on a video clip circulating online. She decided to visit Mason directly, bringing a copy of footage recorded by her own car's dashboard camera, which had captured Hunter removing the metal object from his glove moments before the match began. Mason thanked her for the footage, but showed no visible relief at receiving it. He asked instead what exactly she wanted from him. Catherine admitted she was investigating Lucas over signs of fraud buried inside the acquisition deal. She also confessed she wanted to understand why a man with his evident skill had allowed the Jackson family to push him into such a defensive corner in the first place. Mason answered that winning a single fight was never the same as winning an entire war. Had he injured Hunter seriously in that ring, Lucas would have gained exactly the narrative he needed all along. Catherine realized then that Mason had seen the trap laid out before him from the very beginning, long before she had noticed it herself. Their conversation shifted into something quieter and more personal. Catherine noticed that Mason had carefully repaired Grace's small wooden marker using glue and 2 thin splints, mending a nearly worthless object with the same precision he might have once applied to something far more consequential. That small act of care moved her more deeply than any heroic story ever could have. Mason poured coffee for them both, and the two talked briefly about what it meant to live beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Catherine admitted that her own father had built his company from nothing but died before he ever believed his daughter was capable of leading it. Mason told her that some people spend their entire lives chasing approval from someone no longer able to give it. The remark landed with more weight than he perhaps intended, and Catherine understood he was speaking about himself as much as about her. Samuel Reed arrived at the house shortly after, having received a copy of the data Mace had sent him earlier that week. Samuel revealed that Jackson Global Security had once supplied navigation equipment under a defense contract, some of which was later discovered to contain counterfeit components. The investigation into that discovery had stalled years earlier for lack of original source documentation. Mason was holding a storage drive that a former teammate had passed along to him shortly before that man's death, a device that might contain evidence tied directly to Lucas's wider network. Mason had never opened it, since the data remained encrypted and could potentially touch on information still classified at the federal level. Catherine discovered that Lucas wanted more than a simple access road across Mason's land. The proposed route was designed to run cable systems and a utility tunnel directly beneath the workshop behind Mason's house. It was becoming clear that Lucas may have known exactly what Mason was keeping there all along. Hunter believed he was simply pressuring a stubborn neighbor into selling a strip of dirt. In truth, Lucas had been using his own son as cover for a much larger effort to recover a piece of evidence that could end everything he had built. Catherine warned Mason that Lucas might act more aggressively very soon. Mason glanced toward the dark house next door and answered quietly that Lucas had already begun. Lucas learned that Catherine had halted the acquisition and suspected immediately that Mason was working alongside her. He ordered 2 of his private security men to break into Mason's workshop that night, telling them they were only searching for property documents. He deliberately kept Hunter in the dark about the storage drive and about the deeper defense fraud investigation tied to it entirely. Hunter, eager to prove his usefulness to his father once again, insisted on joining them despite not fully understanding what they were searching for. After Samuel's earlier warning, Mason had already taken Grace to stay somewhere safe. He left the house looking undefended on the surface while quietly arranging cameras, motion sensors, and backup lighting throughout the property. He set no dangerous traps of any kind. His only goal was to gather clear evidence and hold any intruders in place until the police arrived. Catherine was on her way to deliver legal documents, proving that Lucas had falsified the property boundary maps, when she noticed 3 figures climbing over the fence near Mason's house. She called the police immediately, then sent Mason a warning of her own. The 2 security men forced open the workshop door while Hunter trailed behind, repeatedly asking whether they had found the drive yet. Mason emerged from the shadows and ordered all 3 of them to set down whatever tools they were carrying. One of the men drew a stun weapon. The other gripped a metal bar. Mason moved quickly, disarming each man in turn without causing serious injury to either of them. He used the workbench, the narrow doorway, and the tight confines of the room itself to strip away any advantage their numbers might have given them. Every motion he made was precise, economical, and deliberate, honed across years of training in far more dangerous spaces than a suburban workshop. Hunter, seeing Mason fight for the first time without restraint, froze in place, terrified by what he was witnessing. While stumbling backward, Hunter knocked over a shelf holding several containers of solvent. A broken lamp sparked against the spilled liquid, and flames climbed quickly near the doorway. The 2 security men bolted immediately, abandoning Hunter trapped behind a fallen metal shelf. Mason could have chased down the men now fleeing with a stolen box in hand. Instead, he turned back to save Hunter. He grabbed a fire blanket to smother the flames, lifted the shelf pinning Hunter in place, and pulled him clear of the workshop only seconds before a small fuel canister ignited behind them. Catherine, arriving just in time, watched Mason risk himself to protect the very person who had spent weeks trying to destroy his life. Shaken and lightly injured, Hunter asked why Mason had bothered saving him at all. Mason answered that nothing in Hunter's past gave him the right to decide that Hunter's future should end inside a burning building. The answer shattered something his father had spent years teaching him, the belief that people only ever act out of self-interest. The box the 2 men had carried away turned out to be a decoy, empty of anything meaningful. The actual storage drive had been hidden inside the very wooden marker Mason had repaired for Grace weeks earlier. Catherine realized that Mason had used a seemingly worthless object to protect the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Police arrived and arrested both security men near the scene. Hunter initially considered lying to protect his father, but stopped when he overheard one of the men admit that Lucas himself had given the order for the break-in. Hunter finally understood that his own father had placed him in genuine danger purely to retrieve a single storage drive. Samuel arrived shortly afterward carrying a federal search warrant. He gave Hunter 2 choices. He could continue protecting Lucas and risk becoming an accomplice, or he could hand over every text message, every instruction, and every piece of internal data he still had access to. Hunter did not answer right away. He looked toward Mason, who stood beside the smoldering workshop, still asking the paramedics whether the 2 fleeing intruders had been injured at all. For the first time, Hunter understood the real difference between the power his father wielded so carelessly and the strength Mason possessed but consistently chose never to abuse. When word reached him that the break-in had failed, Lucas called an urgent meeting at the estate, pacing the length of his office as calls went unanswered and emails piled up unread. He planned to move funds, wipe his servers, and leave the country by private helicopter before anyone could stop him, already calculating which accounts could be emptied fastest and which records needed to vanish first. Catherine arrived with members of her own board and announced, in front of everyone present, that the acquisition of Jackson Global Security was officially canceled. She laid out the financial discrepancies, the counterfeit components, and the falsified property maps for the entire room to hear. Lucas remained composed, confident that no one yet held direct proof he had personally issued any of the orders. Then Hunter walked into the middle of the meeting. He handed his phone, his laptop, and a recorded conversation with his father over to Samuel. Hunter admitted openly that he had harassed Mason for weeks at his father's quiet encouragement. Lucas called his own son weak and ungrateful in front of everyone in the room. Hunter answered that Mason, the very man he had spent weeks tormenting, had turned back inside a burning building to save his life, while his own father had let him walk into real danger without ever telling him the truth. It was the moment Hunter's arc finally turned a corner. He was not transformed into a good man overnight, but for the first time he accepted responsibility for what he had done. Lucas lost control entirely. He pulled a handgun from a drawer in his desk and grabbed Catherine, holding her as leverage while demanding that Samuel hand over the storage drive immediately. Mason appeared in the doorway but did not rush forward. He studied the angle of Lucas's grip, the distance to Catherine, and the faint reflection visible in the glass behind them. Lucas mocked him, insisting a discharged serviceman held no power left worth mentioning. Mason answered that he had not come as a soldier at all. He had come as the neighbor Lucas had underestimated one too many times. Catherine stayed remarkably calm, watching for the smallest signal from Mason's eyes. She leaned aside at the exact instant he tossed a small object to draw Lucas's attention away. Mason crossed the distance in a heartbeat, seized the wrist holding the weapon, and forced the barrel safely away from Catherine. There was no drawn-out struggle of the kind such moments often demand. Lucas was an aging businessman, never a trained fighter capable of matching a former Navy SEAL in any real sense. Mason disarmed him within seconds and held him in place until Samuel arrived to place him in handcuffs. Once free, Catherine tried to appear composed, though her hands trembled faintly at her sides. Mason did not embrace her right away. He asked only whether she had been hurt, then waited patiently for her to close the distance on her own terms. Catherine reached out and took his hand. That small, quiet gesture carried more trust than any hurried, dramatic kiss ever could have. As Lucas was led away in restraints, the grand estate he had built on secrecy and deception stood exposed at last as the very scene of his own downfall, its wide marble halls suddenly silent except for the sound of footsteps carrying him toward a waiting patrol car. The footage from the charity event, the recording from Catherine's dashboard camera, and Hunter's own testimony together proved that Mason had done nothing beyond defending himself during the match. The complete, unedited video was finally released to the public, showing clearly how Hunter had cheated and how Mason had repeatedly avoided causing him serious harm throughout the entire encounter. Local news outlets that had once painted Mason as a threat now revisited the story with a very different tone, quietly retracting the earlier headlines that had once cost him clients and turned his neighbors against him. Clients who had once walked away from Mason's consulting business sent apologies. Mason made no attempt to capitalize on the sudden attention. He declined every interview request about his years as a Navy SEAL and offered only a brief statement, explaining that his military service did not place him above the law, and that wealth did not place the Jackson family above anyone else either. The evidence recovered from the storage drive revealed the full scope of what Lucas had done. He had replaced certified components with counterfeit parts, falsified inspection reports, bribed several contractors, concealed known failures in military equipment, ordered the break-in at Mason's home, and forged the property boundary records from the very beginning. Lucas faced numerous federal charges as a result. His assets were frozen, and his company was placed under independent oversight while the investigation continued. The scandal spread quickly through the business community, and several partners who had once courted Lucas for his connections now scrambled to distance themselves from his name entirely. Hunter pleaded guilty to charges connected to trespassing, harassment, and his role in the break-in. Because he cooperated fully with investigators and provided crucial evidence, he avoided the harshest possible sentence, though he still faced community service, financial restitution, and mandatory participation in a behavioral accountability program. Mason never asked for leniency on Hunter's behalf, nor did he push for a harsher punishment. He believed firmly that mercy never meant erasing consequences entirely. Hunter eventually came to Mason's house to apologize in person. Mason did not offer forgiveness right away. He told Hunter plainly that real change was never proven through a single apology, but through the choices a person made afterward, day after day, when no one else was watching. Catherine offered Mason a position as Director of Risk Assessment at Bennett Strategic Systems. Mason declined the full-time role, unwilling to return to a life that demanded constant travel away from Grace. Catherine adjusted the offer into a flexible advisory position instead, one built entirely around his schedule rather than her company's convenience. She made clear she was not trying to rescue him from anything. Her company genuinely needed someone with his exact expertise, and she was willing to respect the boundaries he had built around his life without question. Mason told her he would think it over, and for the first time in a long while, the thought of a future beyond his own fence line did not feel like a threat waiting to happen. Months later, the Jackson estate was sold. A portion of the disputed land was converted into shared green space under the court's final ruling. Mason's fence was rebuilt and Grace's swing still hung in exactly the same spot it always had. Grace only appeared briefly upon returning home, noticing that the garden had been restored and that her small wooden marker remained perfectly intact. Mason never described the gun, the break-in, or the fight in any real detail. He told her only that some people had made poor choices, and now they were learning how to make things right again. In a short scene of his own, Hunter began helping repair homes for veteran families as part of his community service program. No one treated him like a Jackson there. There was no assistant, no camera crew, and no powerful father standing behind him anymore. When he watched another man being mocked by onlookers, Hunter did not join in this time. Instead, he stepped forward and helped the man lift a heavy piece of lumber into place. It was a small gesture, nothing more, a sign that Hunter's transformation had only just begun rather than being complete. Catherine visited Mason's house one quiet weekend afternoon. She wore no business attire and carried no contracts with her. Instead, she brought a young sapling to plant in the exact spot where one of the trees had been cut down by the old construction crew. Mason asked whether this counted as a business visit or a personal one. Catherine admitted she had spent far too many years scheduling everything around work, and she was finally trying something that had no place on any calendar at all. They planted the tree together. Grace appeared for a few minutes, handing Catherine a newly painted wooden marker before heading back inside to keep drawing. Catherine confessed she had no idea where their relationship might eventually lead. Mason told her he did not need to know that answer right away either. He had spent years treating every uncertainty as a threat to be neutralized. Now he wanted to learn how to treat some uncertainties as an opportunity instead. Catherine rested her hand over his and Mason did not pull away. They sat together on the porch, watching the young tree sway gently in the wind. There was no rushed proposal and no premature declaration of love, only the quiet sense of two people who had long lived behind their own private walls slowly beginning to open a door between them. The old house still stood modestly beside the sprawling land next door, but Mason no longer felt as though he were defending it alone. Hunter had once believed that strength meant forcing other people to their knees. Mason Carter had shown him that real strength lay in holding the power to destroy someone completely, and choosing instead to reach out a hand and lift them back up. Mason Carter never asked to be seen as a hero. He only wanted a quiet life, a safe home, and a daughter who never had to learn what war truly cost. Yet when arrogance and cruelty pushed against everything he loved, he answered not with rage, but with restraint, and not with revenge, but with mercy that few people around him could even understand. Hunter learned that real strength was never about domination, and Catherine learned that trust could grow slowly, without ever needing to be forced. If this story reminded you that quiet people often carry the deepest strength, and that grace can outlast even the wealthiest cruelty, take a moment to sit with that thought before you go. Sometimes the strongest hands are the ones that choose to lift instead of strike.